Let's go to that.
Economic environment. In October, the government will have to respond to several known expenditure pressures. For instance, the new public service wage agreement is forecast to cost us about 30.2 billion over the medium-term expenditure framework. The depreciation of our currency and an increase in government bond yields means that more resources will be required to service our debt. The precarious financial position of several state-owned companies has created an over-reliance on borrowing to fund ongoing regular operational expenditures, which is an untenable situation over the long term. Now, 10 years ago, government looked to some of our entities like Eskom, Trans-Caledon Tunnel Authority, TCTA, Transnet, and others to launch an infrastructure drive that helped to mitigate the worst effects of the global financial crisis. Unfortunately, in recent years, many of these critical state-owned companies have had their ability to contribute to economic growth severely weakened. Now, government will have to explore ways to strengthen the balance sheets of these institutions in a way that does not harm fiscal sustainability. It is abundantly clear that in the long term, no amount of fresh capital or debt will save these institutions outside a radical rethinking of their business models and a commitment to good, clean governance. Now, in a month's time, government will present the 2018 medium-term budget policy statement, and without disclosing any of the details again of the presentation, I can say that Cabinet has agreed that fiscal sustainability must remain the focus of government's efforts in public finance management. This should be a statement that makes clear government's intention to pursue a prudent fiscal policy that stabilizes our debt-to-GDP ratio over the long term. Excuse me. Whilst we do not expect the new government public service wage agreement to harm the expenditure ceiling, this year in particular, it is important that government protects the composition of spending, ensuring that resources are directed towards service delivery. Government remains committed to the compensation ceilings presented in our 2018 MTF. Several options are under consideration to address the additional cost of the new wage agreement, as announced by the Department of Public Service and Administration. These include, among others, updated employee-initiated severance package and early retirements to encourage qualifying public servants to exit the public service. In both the President's State of the Nation address and the budget, government committed to addressing several inhibitors to growth. Some of the initiatives that are underway are the SOC governance reforms. This process is being overseen by the President himself. Already, this process is beginning to yield results with the return of several SOCs to capital markets where previously they had been shut out, like Eskom, Transnet, TCTA, were now able to secure new long-term debt to replace their maturing facilities. A commission of inquiry into the governance of the South African Revenue Services is underway, and its findings and recommendations should help us improve the efficiency of the institution. Government is also redoubling efforts to address the main issues that are inhibiting growth and weak investment. This includes building a pipeline of investment opportunities and infrastructure projects. Already, national government has identified 64 projects through our budget facility for infrastructure, which is located in the Treasury, and subjected 38 of these to a rigorous financial and technical evaluation. Institutions like our Development Bank of Southern Africa, the Industrial Development Corporation, and the New Development Bank, that's the British Bank, as well as commercial banks and other financiers, will be critical to ensure that we leverage concessional finance along with the project implementation capacity and governance expertise that these institutions can bring to address our infrastructure backlogs. These institutions help to address infrastructure backlogs in cities which sap the economy of its dynamism. We've also looked at the private sector participation framework, which is now well established and mature, which provides for alternative financing strategies to enable infrastructure investment. It also allows state-owned companies to partner with the private sector companies to enable a faster, more efficient delivery of goods, services, and economic infrastructure to support the country's higher economic growth aspirations and to transformation goals. Now, in due course, the President will be announcing a package of measures that we've been working on as the economics cluster of government to stimulate economic growth. The President is clear that government's participation in this program will be through existing budget resources and will be focused on unlocking efficiencies within the public sector. At a time when global interest rates are rising, all public sector institutions need to be more prudent in their borrowing and ensure that these funds are matched to projects with high returns and high development impact. Now, government, business, labor, and society as a whole need to work together to lay the foundation for faster growth by narrowing the budget deficit, stabilizing our debt, strengthening governance, and making the necessary investments for faster growth in the future. Perhaps let me leave it there, and thank you for your attention, so that I can perhaps respond to your specific questions if you have any.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these remarks, which do touch on really many of the key topics that we've addressed today. And so I would like to ask a few questions, maybe to get into a bit more detail on the fiscal outlook for South Africa. If I can start with developments since the budget last February. As you mentioned, some of the developments have maybe moved in a different direction. The wage bill looks like it will be somewhat higher than assumed. At the same time, the government had also committed on certain expenditure, in particular on education. So in the short term, what measures, what tools, what measures do you envisage to comply with the budget's objective, and in particular with the fiscal consolidation objective for South Africa?
Thank you for the question. And as you have also mentioned, among other things, what we had done, you recall that the government also announced an increase in value-added tax of 1 percentage point in order to meet some of those pressures. But also on the expenditure side, there was a very clear initiative of making sure that we keep expenditure within the limits, and all departments have committed to that. And as I said also, that in order to contain the cost of employment, we have several initiatives, one of them being that of employee-initiated severance package, so that some of those, because we do need to reduce the number of, the headcount in the public sector. But I said also, I think the first year of our MTEF is not so much under pressure. It is the outer years which we are focusing on going forward. So all those initiatives, including the increase in our taxes and dealing with the issue of expenditure, are intended to be able to stay within the ceiling.
And so over that more medium-term horizon, do you envisage more emphasis on the revenue side, on the expenditure side? Are there particular policy areas that your government would like to really focus on to stabilize the debt burden?
Because I said one of the things, what is critical in order to address our challenge is to invest a lot in growing the economy. And the structural reforms that I spoke about that form part of what the President will be announcing shortly, which will also part of our midterm budget policy statement, are all intended to make sure that we unlock the economic growth. And if you look at the contraction also of our economy in the first and second quarter, you will see that it is in those areas where we are beginning to focus our attention and initiatives to try and grow the economy, because that will firstly address our biggest challenge. If we can address the issue of growth, we would be in a better position to deal even with our debt situation as well.
Thank you. Now, maybe moving to another area that is relevant to the fiscal side, but touching on the fiscal institutions, which in South Africa had long been very strong internationally by all measures, but which we had seen weakening somewhat in recent years. And I'm thinking in particular about the South Africa Revenue Service ability to collect taxes. Now, your government has put some emphasis on addressing this. What particular steps are you taking to help SARS capacity to improve its tax collection?
Well, as you would know, in terms of actually dealing with SARS, one of the things is that there is currently a commission that is beginning to look at the governance of SARS in general. It is underway as we speak, and we hope that the outcome and the findings of that process will assist us in order to restore that institution to its former strength. But beyond that, we are currently working with the team. The executive at SARS are very hard at work to make sure that we deal with some of the structural and organizational issues within the organization, among others being the issue of compliance, especially of the high net worth individuals, and a unit that had actually been doing very well, which is the large business unit within SARS, is now in the process of being revived, and we also are beginning to look at the efficiency of collection in order to close the tax gap. It's for that reason that I said, despite the underperformance of the economy, we are quite confident that we would be able to make a difference in that space. We're dealing with a number of things in that space, the issues of staff morale, the issues of making sure that the communication between the institution and the taxpayer out there is being enhanced and improved, and I think we're making good progress in that space.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You mentioned state-owned companies and the financial pressure that there is on some of them. And that is indeed a topic that resonated throughout the day today, whether it was talking from a sovereign perspective about the risks that might crystallize on the government's balance sheet, or talking from then the state-owned enterprise, Eskom, and other perspective about the ongoing pressure and measures being taken. How do you, here I'm particularly interested in your assessment from a government's perspective, how do you look at the risks associated with state-owned companies' debt in general, and the risks that the government might need to provide support to these entities? And can you give us some pointers as to really the nature of these risks?
Look, on a quarterly basis and on an annual basis, we conduct the credit risk assessments on these state-owned companies that have got government guarantees in order to determine the extent of government's exposure emanating from these guarantees. The results of these assessments are presented to Parliament and the Fiscal Liabilities Committee within the Treasury, and which was established by Cabinet some time back to assist. So now what we do is we prudently manage government's contingent liabilities. We take this information into consideration when making decisions about whether to recommend that the minister approves a new guarantee or not. But what we're doing with these state entities, working with the Department of Public Enterprises under the leadership of Minister Gordon, who is former Minister of Finance as well. So it's got a fair understanding of what this means for the country. But we've dealt with the issues of governance in these state entities, starting with the largest, Eskom, if I were to say so, making sure that a proper board is put in place, that you have a new executive that is in place, and the people that have been involved in all sorts of corruption and maladministration have been dealt with. Some have left, some are facing disciplinary charges, but the issues of governance are given serious attention. And then The second part is looking at their financial health. And we've been working very, very hard at that. And as I said, that some of them that could not go out into the market today, they are able to do that because we've actually been able to bring back the confidence in those institutions. And then going forward, I said we've put in place, there is this state-owned company council that is chaired by the president himself at the moment. It is intended to begin to look at the entire overhaul and restructuring of our state-owned companies in terms of making sure that they are all fit for purpose, and in keeping with the government's decisions also of introducing private sector participation in some of them, in line with the private sector participation framework that has now matured within government to begin to look at that. So some of them is going to be looking at their business models to make sure that they are fit for purpose, but some of them are also going to be strengthened such that they are able to deliver on their mandate. We've also worked on a process of making sure that they are able to cost their developmental mandates so that their commercial mandates actually are strong enough to be able to support their developmental mandates.
And could you give us maybe an idea of the time frame here that we're looking at? At what point would you, as a finance minister, be comforted that the state-owned company sector as a whole is on a stronger footing? Are we talking about a few years, a number of years? Just an indication here about what we analysts should be looking out for.
Look, they vary. For instance, the focus was mainly on the bigger ones because the others do not have so much of an impact. But that's why we started with the big one, which is Eskom in this instance. But all of them are receiving our attention. All of them have also given us their turnaround strategies, which are, time-bound. So it would be. Some of them would be in a much shorter space of time, and some of them would take a little longer, and the others would be in the medium term. But we're focusing more on the bigger ones, and Eskom is one of those that we think we should actually resolve this in the shortest possible time.
Thank you. I would like to now move to one or two final questions to maybe broaden the picture a bit, and starting with one which is a question that we in the Sovereign team are really asking ourselves for South Africa, but also for sovereigns more globally. When we observe that, according to our projections, government debt will be relatively stable, and we've discussed that that is the baseline projection for South Africa. That is true of sovereigns in general, but at the same time stable at relatively high levels. And here in South Africa, we've seen the government debt burden rising to 55% of GDP from just around or under 30% of GDP 10 years ago, and a very similar path for sovereigns globally. So that raises the question about what fiscal flexibility will there be in the next phase of the economic and financial cycle. At the moment, globally, at least growth is relatively favorable. That may not last, and so at that point, what fiscal tools will there be to respond to economic and financial stress?
I think you are correct that we actually would be stabilizing around 55 and thereabout, and which also reduces our ability to maneuver. But as I said earlier, I think the focus is on trying to improve on the side of growth. Because if you are able to improve on growing the economy, it would be that would release, create space for us to be able to spend and stay, but still stay within the 50 or below 60, if I were to say so. But I think what is also critical is changing the composition of our expenditure, because a 50% or 60% is not such a bad, figure if the composition of expenditure is such that the bulk of it is in investment rather than in consumption. So I think the focus is just trying to look at the quality of our expenditure and at the same time try and grow the economy such that the denominator improves in order to change the matrix.
Thank you. One last question, which is really your view when you look forward over the next several years. What do you perceive as the key upside and downside risks for South Africa's fiscal outlook?
Well, the upside is that I think we are going to be moving from a lower base, but we've identified the sectors that we think would be able to deliver the growth that we are looking for. But at the same time, we also think that the structural reforms that are underway, which are also very, very much time-bound, are in a position to unlock the growth that has actually held us back. Evidence of some of that, if you look at when this administration came in at the beginning of the year, around February, first thing that we did, we had our power purchase agreements, which had been held in abeyance for a long time. And by merely just signing those and getting, some of that investment coming into the economy, it created space for investment that otherwise had been held back for some time. So that's a clear demonstration. And you can see we already have put our integrated resource plan in the public domain. We have our minister in the mineral resources space already talking to stakeholders. We're likely to see our mining charter being resolved very, very soon. I just can't give the dates now because the minister working on it is working flat out to make sure that that is resolved as a matter of agency. Quite a number of other initiatives. We spoke about our cost of communications with the release of the spectrum, also in the pipeline. All of those things, when they happen, we are likely to begin to see growth taking a completely different trajectory.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. I think that leaves me to thank you very much for being so generous with your time and for touching on a very wide range of topics. I think you have provided views there of both the short-term and the more medium-term fiscal outlook, some of the challenges, but also some of the strength that South Africa might achieve in a somewhat more robust growth environment as and when the measures currently being implemented take stock. So thank you very much on behalf of Moody's and the whole audience here today. Thank you.
Finance Minister Nhlanhla Nene addressing the Moody's Sub-Saharan Africa conference, doing a Q&A there, answering questions such as when will state-owned enterprises, when will he feel like they're doing well? He has said that Eskom, big SOEs like Eskom in the short term are going to be improved more. He also spoke about the South African Revenue Service, how they're bringing that under control and how government remains committed to the compensation ceiling and cutting down on all the spending. Nompumelelo Siziba, my colleague, is there and will give us a little bit of an update on this. For now, it's time for a short break.